Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Fort, and we're here for the 10th of a 32-ish part series as we journey chapter by chapter through Fairy Tale by Stephen King. This is, incoincidentally, chapter 10. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with some comments from the previous video, then we're going to get into a So What Happened portion of this video. Then we're going to transition to literary topics from the chapter, and finally, writer's notes from the chapter. We get this from Mike. Glad you mentioned anachronistic dialogue. I'm sure it's time-consuming to craft a character down to their dialogue level, but the best writers usually manage. When an author's characters are nuanced and individual, I notice and appreciate it. So, one of the things that I think is sort of a shortcut to this type of dialogue, because we talked about the characters in this story using phrases that seem out of generation for them. Now, it's individuals will talk however they talk, but if an individual is going to use semi-anachronistic dialogue, it has to sort of be part of their character. One of the shortcuts, I think, to making authentic dialogue is that dialogue is not about what is said, is not about what a character speaks. Dialogue is really about what a character's thinking. Oftentimes, the best way to sort of imagine this, or the easiest way to diagnose this, is when a character does not respond to a question he or she is asked. If I say, hey, what time is it? And you say, would you please, 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 please shut up? That tells the reader, you are irritated with me. If I say, hey, what time is it? And you respond by saying, "Did you know there's a Royals game tonight?" What that communicates is that you are not maybe necessarily aggravated with me. You're aggravated with whatever is the subject of the reason I'm asking for the time. Right? So what you're doing is you're communicating what the other person is thinking. You're not speaking in this little back and forth between two people. You're giving us, we get it often in this book with the interactions between Charlie and Bowditch. Charlie will say something that's sort of saccharine, and Bowditch yells at him about something else. Don't put that on the coffee table, right? Those sorts of things. What that tells us is that Bowditch is ignoring everything sweet that Charlie is trying to do for him because he's sort of a crusty old guy. Those moments are very authentic to Bowditch. They're also authentic to Charlie because Charlie is worried about Bowditch. Charlie is the caretaker type. Charlie is the one who is the alpha type personality. And I mention that because there's another note in this section. I don't know if you caught it, but Mike also said something about reading Pet Sematary, and because I had mentioned last week about, what other Stephen King books would be good for chapter by chapter read-alongs. He mentioned Pet Sematary, and Stacy mentioned The Green Mile. I have not read The Green Mile. I have seen the movie. I have heard that it is one of the more literary attempts that comes to us from Stephen King. So it might be interesting to do either of those. I don't have any... When I was real small, I saw 30 minutes of Pet Sematary. And see, this is one of the things that is so great about Stephen King. I remember, I think it was a lady coughing out what looked like donut filling. The pudding to donut fillings. The donut filling pudding. Whatever it's called. I don't know. You see what I'm saying, though. I think there's a scene like that in that movie. And I was, whoa, what is this? I was very small, very young, I think. It was during the summer, and my mother was watching that movie, and I went outside to play. That's all I remember. But this is one of the things that is so confounding about this book. So far, we are 160 some pages in, I think, by the end of this chapter. 177 pages in by the end of this chapter. Stephen King is so good with visual moments. Moments that you see even in the writing. Moments that when a director gets the script to a Stephen King... when a script writer gets the assignment that he's going to be making a script from a Stephen King book, he or she has to put those moments in because they're so visual and they're so cinematic right there in the book. We don't have any of those. Moving on, the final comment that we have to talk about comes to us from Sean, who says, "Canon is just the best Led Zeppelin 4, not the last few." Because I had asked you guys, what is canon? How do we define it? And this is an interesting, quirky argument. That canon is to be defined by the audience. That canon is to be defined by the consumer. That canon is to be defined by the people taking the art. And I think there's a great deal of merit to this. I don't think canon belongs to the artist at all. Because once that work is out there, the artist does not own it anymore. It doesn't belong. This book does not belong to Stephen King anymore. It's published. It's out there in the hands of readers. It belongs to readers. But by the same token, I was a comic fan growing up. There are no shortage of stupid Wolverine comics. I don't allow... So the way this graphs onto graphic novels would be, I do not allow the individual series writer to tell me what is canon. Neither, however, do I allow Marvel proper to tell me what is canon. That is my decision. Is canon something that belongs to each of us? Is canon something that belongs to the audience as a whole, as a collective? I think this is something interesting to talk about. So, moving on to the So What Happened portion of this Chapter 10 video. Charlie goes into the house and it is absolutely wrecked. Charlie calls Dad. Dad calls the police. Charlie checks the gold in the safe and the police show up. And they're not particularly impressive individuals, these police. They sort of just kind of figured that it was someone who was doing break-ins based on the obituary papers, which... So this, one thing I will grant Stephen King is that this might happen because we are in a smaller town. I live in Kansas City. No one reads the Kansas City Star. Not a thing. The obituaries are dead, ironically. But in a smaller town, the newspaper might still be a big deal. The newspaper being a big deal in an era with cell phones is wild. There was a period of time where that was true. It's just a strange little period of time. Very difficult to remember exactly. Charlie talks to the neighbor and she says that there was somebody trying to go around and sell magazines door to door, which was kind of weird. Again, we're in the magazine era. Charlie returns to the house and grabs the tape player. Oh, so they go home after the the hullabaloo, and Charlie's got to go back and pick up some of his stuff. But he gets that tape recorder and presses play, and on page 163, we get this. Hold on. 160, yeah. This comes to us from Bowditch on the tape player. Did your father investigate me, Charlie? I bet he did. I know I would have if I had been in his shoes, and I bet that given his job, he had the resources to do it. If so, he will have found out that someone named Adrian Bowditch, maybe my father, he would have thought, more likely grandfather, bought the land this house stands on in 1920. It wasn't either of them. It was me. I was born Adrian Howard Bowditch in 1894, which makes me just about 120 years old. The house was finished in 1922, or maybe 1923, I can't remember for sure. And the shed, of course, we mustn't forget the shed. That was built even before the house, and by my own hands. Dum dum dum! Then we have on 164, 3 years later in 1975. This is a different part of the story, but the rest of the story in between was not all that important. I came back as my son, Howard Bowditch, age around 40. Howard supposedly lived most of his life up to then abroad with his mother, who was estranged from her husband. I always liked that detail. Estrangement is somehow more real than divorce or death. Also, it's a wonderful word, full of flavor. After Adrian Bowditch supposedly died in Egypt, I took up residence at the family manse and decided to stay. There was no doubt about ownership. I had willed it to myself. Rich, wouldn't you say? Before I tell you the rest, I want you to stop the tape and go out to the shed. And so, giant cockroaches. Giant cockroaches. Yep. Oh, and the Well of the Worlds, right? There's that there as well. Small detail, Well of the Worlds. So, Bowditch accidentally the story goes that Bowditch had accidentally fallen into the well and decided to go on discovering. If you shone the flashlight between the boards, you know I was lucky not to be killed. There's no handrail, and the steps wind around a nasty drop, just about 175 feet. The walls are cut from stone, did you notice? Very old. God knows how old. Some of the blocks have fallen out and tumbled to the bottom, where there's a pile of them. As I tilted toward the drop, I threw my hand out and caught a hold of a fissure in one of those empty sockets. Couldn't have been more than 3 inches wide, but it was enough to get my fingers in and pulled myself back against the curve of the wall, looking up at daylight and bright blue sky, my heart beating what felt like 200 licks to a minute. Wondering what the hell I'd stumbled into. It surely wasn't any ordinary well, not with stone steps going down and cut stone blocks walling around it. So that's basically where we're at. Bowditch falls into this well and goes on a hunting and discovers that there is a whole other world just through this well. Giant animals, and the air here is toxic to those animals except for the bats. But the air there, very good and rich for us. And that's basically all. That is basically where we get here. So I want to talk about some of the stuff at the beginning of this chapter, because maybe, which it's Stephen King, if you read on writing, came from very, very humble beginnings. One thing that you can kind of tell was not involved in those humble beginnings was a whole lot of crime. So this comes to us from 155 into 156. The contents of the canisters, sugar, flour, coffee, cookies, had been spilled across the counter, but the one that contained money no longer did. And the first coherent thought to cross my mind was, blank didn't get it. I put the cash and the little gold pellets in the safe months ago. If you sort of listen to survivalists, they will tell you that if you have a safe, you don't have a safe, you have a target. So pretend you do have a safe. And pretend Charlie shows up back at this house. We'll put it in the story. Charlie goes back to this house, and those fellas that tore the place up, they're not gone. No, they're hiding in the closet. Pretend that. They heard him coming, and they decided, oh, okay, we'll do it this way. He comes up, checks the safe, and guess what time it is? It's time to open the safe. And maybe Charlie, 6'4", 230 pounds, whatever it was that he said, right? Maybe Charlie thinks, I'm a tough guy. I'm not going to open that safe. Well, Charlie, the human body is very resilient. But one thing you never stop feeling is pain. Yes, you would open the safe. One of the things that a lot of survivalists will do is, if they do have a safe, it is to hold the guns. Because if someone breaks in and they don't happen to have guns, now I have a strategic advantage. You were a moron breaking into a house. You were someone who was unprepared. You were an amateur criminal. If, however, a professional criminal breaks in, they have their own weapons. So what's in that safe isn't going to do them any good. So you don't keep the valuables in the safe. You keep something that might be in the safe, like your tax documents. That makes sense. Especially if it's a flame retardant safe. Those types of things make sense. Maybe you don't have anything else. Okay. Maybe you've got the guns. If they were going to shoot you, it would be with their guns anyway. Or it would be with your guns, but hey, those guns are theirs now anyway. They don't have any advantage, right? Survivalist types, people who come from places where there is a lot of crime, don't have a safe. They have some place they hide stuff. Another interesting thing that this type of person will do is they'll carry, in much in the same fashion, a decoy wallet. You put $20 in it. You put an expired driver's license. No one's checking the date. Not when they first grab your license, they hold you up on the street. You put maybe an expired credit card, right? You keep that one in your back pocket. Maybe you keep your real wallet in your thigh pocket. Whatever it is. But it's much the same principle. You can comply in that fashion without actually complying. And if they were going to kill you after they got your wallet anyway, they're still going to kill you. But they're going to kill you and not have your cards. So they got nothing out of it, didn't they? So that is just an interesting sort of take. The brazen nature of Charlie in this ransacked house and him returning to the house. Look, the cops that were there, the sort of idiot cops, they would have told him, it's all right, you can go back. They got what they were coming for. They just, saw it in the obituaries and decided to ransack a house. Charlie doesn't believe that's the case. Why is Charlie going back alone and unarmed? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So the neighbor lady has a convenient story, doesn't she? Oh, yeah, there was something strange. I did notice something weird. It was some other guy selling magazines, yes. People sell magazines, don't they? Door to door, in fact. Yes, that's what I noticed. So I would be as suspicious of the neighbor lady as anybody else. But on 163, we get this. From Charlie, telling us the story. I said I was sure I could tell this story, but I was also sure no one would believe it. This is where your disbelief begins. On page 163, really? Really? We've read 163 pages, Stephen. You couldn't give us just a little hint of disbelief before this? There couldn't be some titter of questionality? There couldn't be some jot of the mysterious? We had to wait all this time. We had to wait all this way, 163 pages. And then on 164, this idea, estrangement is somehow more real than divorce or death. Yeah, probably. Because we have a squirrely nature about us, don't we? Us people. Us human folk. We have a squirrely nature about us to just disappear. That's estrangement. As opposed to divorce or death. I didn't die. We didn't get divorced. We didn't make it official. I just didn't come home one day. It didn't seem like the right thing to do. And the next day, it seemed a little bit less like the right thing to do. And then after that, I mean, it's just one day after another, it would become more strange to show back up. To send that little message. Said, hey, still care about you. Couldn't do this because of me. How often does that happen? How real is that? Much more real than handling the problem or dying. And when we think of the word estranged, how could we relate that in this story to anyone besides Bowditch? The mom character dies. That's where she goes. She's gone. The father character stays, has to get his stuff together. Very difficult, very hard. Divorces, if you will, the alcohol. But what about Bowditch? We've got this idea that Bowditch was sort of a loner. We've got this idea that Bowditch was a man with his dog. Was Bowditch becoming estranged? Not just from his hypothetical wife/mother, right? As he came back as his own son. Was Bowditch becoming estranged with the idea of society writ large? Something to think about, especially as we're searching for what this metaphor of the other world might mean. Clearly, we get to use this as metaphor. The first thing for me, the obvious sort of metaphor for it, is the act of writing. The escape into another world. This estranged individual, this weird, kooky old man, happened upon a portal to another world, happened upon writing, and got rich off of it. Who does that sound like? And now, as he's rich off of it, he finds this strapping young man that he thinks he's going to pass this down to. He thinks that he's going to be able to pass down the act of writing, the other world, the portal to the other world, to this younger guy. And because he's passing it down, And it's a curse as much as it's a gift. It's a curse as much as it is a gift. This other world, this pot of gold, it would kill normal folk. Maybe it's a metaphor for writing, but if it was a metaphor for writing and, Stephen King was Bowditch, who would be Charlie? I mean, is there any real stand-in for who that might be? Why would we get a metaphor in Stephen King's old age about a old man who's kind of weird and kind of got estranged for a period in his life, and then finds a younger guy to pass down this gift to? I don't know, just throwing it out there. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it is. Hard to say. On 165, we get a question that I think is easy to ask when contemplating a story such as this. Hardly anyone lived that long, talking about Bowditch living to 120-ish. Maybe 1 in 10 million, and nobody came back at 40 impersonating his own son. Stuff like that only happens in stories and make-believe. Stories of make-believe. One place where we are often sort of presented this argument in today's world, through today's fiction. Okay, no, let me backtrack from that. One reason this is, no, okay, give me a second. I should have thought this through. It's not at all what I've got written down. I've got a different point written down, but this needs to be explained first, I think, or asked first, I think. There is a genre horror. There is a subgenre of horror, vampires, that often anymore we have period pieces for. There's no new vampire stories, hardly any new vampire stories. Everything, even Twilight, if I'm remembering correctly, has to have an explanation for this. They're from Europe, aren't they? Something like that. Even that is a half an explanation. But in the world that we live in today, where everyone has to have a social security card, everybody has to have an ID, everybody has to have this, has to have that, we had to do this, we had to do that, we have to be trackable. The romantic idea of the timeless individual can't pull it off in today's world. It reminds me here of Interview with a Vampire, right? Interview with a Vampire, if I'm remembering correctly, the Anne Rice story. First off, awful, terrible, miserable, no good, very bad. It is mostly period piece, right? Written in 74, 75 maybe, I think. But it was written about a much older time. Because these ideas of someone who's been around for 120 years, it's hard to pull off now. Very difficult to do. So here, even with this, Stephen King had to come up with a way around that. I don't know why I wrote this note down. I just have written down a giant bug from a land of giants. Do with that what you will. On 169, we get this little bit. When Bowditch is telling the story about his younger days and how he found this land, how he came to this place, how he found the Well of the Worlds, he's talking to us about his home life and why he left. My stepfather, who beat me when things went wrong in his life, which they often did, as he was a heavy drinker who couldn't hold a job for more than a few months at a go. I ran away when I was 17 and went north to Maine. I was a strapping lad. So here we have, again, this idea of parallels between Bowditch and Charlie. Bowditch's father was a drunk. Charlie's father is a drunk. Bowditch was a strapping young lad. Charlie is the prototype strapping young lad. So these are things to keep an eye on as we move forward. Is there something about the air and the land, the new world, that weakens one's heart? Is Charlie going to develop a heart problem? I don't know. Just a question to put out there. Something to look for. While we're talking about something to look for, here on 170, One, 171. We've talked about in this series before the alpha type personality and the sigma type personality. Remember, Charlie represents the alpha type individual. The alpha type, leader type, naturally charismatic type individual like Superman, if we're looking at comic books, for just a rough estimate of something to measure it against, right? And we said that Bowditch was the sigma type. One of the things the sigma types do is they create their own space, their own world, and they retreat to that place. Here we have the story of the sigma type personality, Bowditch, running away completely, refusing the call to adventure of World War I. Why, maybe? Because World War I, says it in the name, is the world's principles on display. Well, the sigma chooses their own principles. The sigma chooses their own society. If we can go back to Emily Dickinson a little bit. Got a lot of Emily Dickinson on the channel if you're not used to that. So remember, Alpha, Sigma. Charlie, Alpha, Superman. Bowditch, Sigma, Batman. 171. As Bowditch is down in the portal to the new world, I raised up my torch and saw a ceiling covered with the biggest damn bats you ever saw. Wingspans like on a turkey buzzard. They rustled more in the light, and I lowered it back between my feet double quick, not wanting to send them flying all around me. This idea of being smothered by their wings gave me what my mother would have called the fantods. Snakes and most insects are okay by me, but I've always had a horror of bats. You know, one thing that strikes me is that the alpha types are often associated with something human or humanoid. Superman is the alpha type. He's an alien, but he's called Superman. Okay. With the X-Men, Cyclops is the alpha type. A Cyclops is a humanoid. Humanoid, not human, not person, but humanoid. Okay. Batman, bats. It's a force of nature. You don't get to rule over the bats. Bats are going to bat. The example with the X-Men is Wolverine. Another animal. Another force of nature. The Sigma type is often associated with animals as well. In the Avengers, it's a little bit different. Captain America is the alpha type, whereas Iron Man, well, force of nature, iron, It just seems to be something that becomes sort of definitional. That the Sigma type individual is associated with something natural, something you don't control, versus the Alpha type associated Superman, Cyclops. These are people who have societies. Man, Cyclops. There was societies of Cyclops. Superman, obviously, the Ubermensch. So moving on to writer's notes. The first thing that stood out to me here, and I think this is important to talk about, because look, it's possible to watch this video and indulge in this book and all of these things and absolutely admire and love the work of Stephen King, but still be able to look at something and say, you're not being very Stephen King here. This is when the police officers are there searching the scene of the torn up house. Cooper dusted black powder over the front of the safe. Some stuck. More drifted onto the floor. Another mess for me to clean up. Cooper looked up at his handiwork, then stood aside so Gleason could look. Wiped clean, he said, straightening up and giving his pants a particularly violent hitch. Of course it was wiped clean. I had done it myself after calling 911. The robber might have left his fingerprints, but even if he did, they still had to go because mine were there too. This sounds like lazy writing to me. This sounds like Stephen King was crafting the scene and realized that Charlie, authentic character, Charlie's pretty real to us, right? Charlie, having the weakness that he has for the gold, would have gone to that safe and checked for it. Then we get the cops involved. As we're writing, it becomes very obvious to Stephen King those cops are going to dust the safe. We never see Charlie wipe the fingerprints clean. This reeks of Stephen King wrote this scene, wrote Charlie checking the safe, wrote the police dusting the safe, and then someone proofread it for Stephen King and said, hey, didn't they find Charlie's prints on the safe? And Stephen, Charlie went in and dusted it off. Even the placement of this argument in the text is clunky because we don't see Charlie dust it off. Maybe I'm wrong. Just throwing that out there. So, one thing that is magnificently done here. The portal to the other world is not only indoors. It's indoors separate from the house. This is sort of like Gollum is precious. Bowditch found the portal and built the shed himself. He tells us that the shed has been there longer than the house. Bowditch found the portal, couldn't risk anyone else getting access to it. So with his greedy little hands, he built himself the shed before he even had the resources to build the house. But even though he had that house built, he knew better than to have his home built around the portal. It's a strange thing to think about. He knew better than to have his home built around the portal. It could have been very easily, if he can make a shed, he could make a little makeshift hardwood floor to put on the ground. Oh, guys, I got this little stage here. I want to build the house around it. It would have been easy to pass off. He can't build a whole house by himself, but he can build that shed. He could have built a stage floor. But he knew to keep those things separate. that is interesting. And one of the reasons it's so interesting as a storyteller is because we get the world between worlds between worlds. Charlie's going to get this house and have to go to the shed. The shed has to go down the well. The well leads to the other world. An intermediary of the intermediary. But the intermediary to the other intermediary can be very scary in a human way. The cockroaches. It's a little shed. There's cockroaches in sheds, right? That happens a lot. Mice in sheds, things like that. We can be scared of those cockroaches in the shed. When we're in the world between worlds, even the bats shouldn't scare us. And when we're in that new world, well, we've yet to see. It's an interesting take from a storyteller. Penultimately, on 166, you remember what it looked like inside that shed, right? The floor was wooden planking. In the far left-hand corner, 3 boards were placed in a row with cinder blocks holding down the ends. I swung the flash to the right and saw something so horrible and unexpected that for a moment I couldn't comprehend it. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. Part of me was thinking, so far as any part of me in those few moments, in those few seconds, so far as part of me could think in those few seconds, that it was a macabre joke. A horror movie creature made out of latex and wire. I could see a single coin of light where the bullet had gone through the wall after going through the thing I was looking at. This is a great example of just how smooth a writer Stephen King is. I want you to take all of those elements and give them to us. Give them to your reader for the first time, knowing you are introducing your reader to this visual. Your reader has never been in this shed. Your reader has never seen these planks. Your reader has never seen the macabre sight. And realize that you're explaining all of this to a reader for the very first time. Stephen King's writing is so often, it doesn't get the credit it deserves for being so clean, for being so smooth. He shows you what he wants you to see when he wants you to see it, but everything makes sense at the same time. You know what a room is. You know what a room looks like. There's 4 corners probably. There's 4 walls. There's a ceiling, there's a floor. When he tells you we're going into a room, you have that in your brain. He knows you've got that part there. He's got to give you the weird stuff to the room. If the room had 8 sides, that would be the first thing he told you. But it doesn't. It has 4. So, the floor was wood planking. In the far left-hand corner, he's showing you these things, building a room, giving you the weird, something so horrible and unexpected. Then we get back out, and we see the bullet hole. And then we go back in after going through the thing I was looking at. It's like an aperture on a camera zooming in and out. Stephen King gave us the idea of the room. Then he gave us a couple characteristics of the room. Then he gave us the important thing we were looking at, something weird, something he didn't know how to handle. Then he gave us something we already knew. There was a bullet hole. Remember? What was the bullet hole from? Old Bowditch had gone down there and shot something, hadn't he? So we got the bullet hole. What was it he shot? These are things that are unquestionably difficult to novice writers. And we're all novice at certain parts in our story because our stories are new to us. So it is interesting to see someone so practiced as Stephen King doesn't even care. Just goes right on in, baby. because he is Stephen King and he's wrote 3,000 books. The last note that I have is here still on 66. And it's a question more than a note. Mr. Bowditch's bullets had caught it in the abdomen, and its pale, unknowable guts lay around its torn belly like weird pudding. A fine mist was drifting up from those innards, and as another gust of breeze slipped past me, yada yada yada. The word unknowable. How do we feel about that? I kind of think it's lazy. I think it's kind of something you don't ever want to, like, unknowable. Who are you, Edgar Allan Poe? Don't give me this gothic type of non-description. It feels to me lazy, especially when the very next thing you do is describe it. The very next thing you do, Stephen, is describe the unknowable. That's all I have for this video. We will be back Wednesday with Chapter 11, Part 11 of this series, and I hope to have you for that video as well.